have time for that, but we'll see. All right. So the first thing obviously is going to be, you know, doing the spread. So we're going to just skip that part though. So this, like, we're starting assuming that you already have the spread down and you already have, like, whatever questions that you were asking, that part's already covered. And this might be easier if you have, like, the picture open with the cards that I pinned. So you might want to have that so you can kind of have something to refer to. But okay, so the first thing with intuitive reading is you always want to get over the initial, like, first impressions. So for example, when I'm doing a reading, I always kind of use the same sort of template. And the first category that I go through is initial impressions. So that's basically you have laid down your cards, you've already done the spread, and it's in front of you. You just want to write down kind of everything that comes to mind about what you're seeing, like, right off the bat. So this should do two things. First of all, any biases that you have about the reading will come out usually when you're doing the initial impressions. So any things that you have, like, preconceived notions about either the person that you're reading for or the situation that they've told you about or the cards themselves, you'll usually get those out and onto the page right away. And that helps you kind of move past those so that you can go into, like, the secondary impressions, which are really kind of the most important ones when you're doing the reading. But also by doing the initial impressions, you also get to, you know, the intuitive part of it is also starting. So anything that's not personal bias in the initial impressions, when you write those down, it'll be like kind of your first sixth sense idea of what might be going on in the reading. The second step would be to go over each card one at a time. So if we start with, let's say, the one on the left, the Nine of Cups. So for each card, you want to do, I usually start with the suits because it's easier. So for example, the suit of cups, you want to figure out what exactly do you relate cups to. So before you get into the reading, what you can do, and this is something you could do, like, for any deck that you get, and like, you do this without the book ideally. So every deck that you get, you would write down each of the suits and have a page for each of them and kind of just go through. So let's say the suit of cups, like, what all does that make me think of? And just write down keywords and kind of brainstorm on any personal associations that you would have with cups. And it's usually going to be a mix of things that you've heard from other tarot people, or, you know, like, maybe from other books that you've read on tarot, but you're also going to have, like, a lot of personal associations with cups that other people might not have, and that's where the intuitive reading comes in. So you'd want to do that for each of the suits, and you'd also want to do that for each number or court card. So for example, the number 9, what does the number 9 make you think of? Like, what associations do you have with it? For example, like, the number 4, I think of, like, how a table has 4 legs, so I think of stability, you know, things like that. So those are all things that you should be doing just kind of, like, on your own before reading. So when you're going through each of the cards, you would want to check the suits first and then the number, and kind of write down all the associations that you have with that could kind of relate together. You also want to do just, like, an actual description of the card itself. So for example, if I look at the first card, I would want to describe exactly what I'm actually seeing, because in different readings you're going to have completely different things that are going to jump out at you. So for example, maybe in this reading, the first thing that I notice is the expression on the face of the figure that's there, and how, like, there's all the fish kind of behind him, around him, like, kind of swirling around, and it looks very active and kind of chaotic. So that might be the first thing that jumps out at me in a reading. But then maybe another time, the first thing that I notice will be how his palms are pointing upwards and how the cups are actually laid out in front of him. And part of intuitive reading would be to kind of take note of what jumps out at you first on each card, because those are the things that are probably more relevant to the reading. You would also want to write down any colors that seem predominant in the card or things like that. So basically like a very literal description of the card itself, the associations that you have with the number and the suit, and that gives you like each card. So those are the 3 things that you would want to do for each card. And once you have all that, you start to put it together. So figuring out like how all these things relate to each other and the situation and the card's position in the spread based on how you've laid out your spread. So once you have it for each of the cards individually, the most important part of the reading, I think, is how the cards actually relate to each other. And I think people often overthink how the cards relate to the spread and the questions in the spread, but the most important part is really how the cards look as a whole, because sometimes the actual cards that you'll have laid out might not fit exactly this spread, and if you're trying too hard to have each card like specifically answer the question, you might be ignoring the fact that it may be answering the question but in a different way, or answering the question a little bit differently than you anticipated. So how to actually put the cards together and read them together. The first part and the easiest part is just looking at anything that comes over like repeatedly. So for example, if you have a lot of purple in a spread, then you would want to mention that becomes important. If let's say all 3 cards have purple in it, then you would want to see like, so what associations do you have with the color purple? Like one really common one would be intuition, that purple relates to the esoteric and intuition and the astral and things like that. So if someone has a lot of purple in a spread, that might be something that would be important. If all of the cards are multiples of 3, that could be relevant. Or if all the cards have a figure in them, that could be relevant. It might be saying that there are people in the person's life that the person needs to be aware of or thinking of, or focusing on more like interpersonal relationships, things like that. Same thing, obviously, if you have like one suit that comes out a lot in the spread and things like that. You also want to look at how the cards interact with each other as far as what is in the card, like the figures in the card, for example, and how they, based on the position in the spread, how they work together. So for example, in the picture that I posted, the middle card has a figure that is looking towards the left, towards the figure that would be in the 9 of Cups card. So that would be, depending on the spread, let's say this is a past, present, future spread, just to keep it simple. So that would be the figure basically in the card for the present spread is looking towards the figure in the past card. So you would want to figure out what is it that's happening in the present that is looking towards the past, and is that good or bad depending on what your spread is about and what the question is. So usually you would associate, but again, this is all dependent on your personal correspondences and things, but usually looking towards the left in a card would be looking towards the past, but it might be, if it's looking towards a different card on the spread, it might be looking towards that specific issue, indicating that there's a relation of some kind, or that these two things are dependent on each other. The card on the right, looking towards the right side, would be possibly looking towards the future, and but if there was another card on the right, then it might be relating those two things. If the figure is looking towards you, then that can usually mean that it's something like important. I call them like a call-out card, which is basically like it's saying like this is important to you right now, and you need to kind of be paying attention to this, and as in like you, the reader, or the person that you're reading for. So that's one way that you could relate the cards to each other. Also, and I didn't put any here, but if let's say one of the cards would have like a sword in it, for example, and if that's the sword in one card was pointing to something in another card, that's also a relation that there could be between the cards. Like ultimately you want to be looking at the spread as if it was like a comic strip, and each of the cards are a panel in the comic strip, and what you need to do as the reader is you're supposed to figure out what like story is the comic strip telling, rather than looking them at them so much as individual things. Like see how they actually relate to each other. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so making your own cards, should you consider this when making each, or let the images just come to you for each versus looking them up? Honestly, yeah, definitely a little bit of both. I actually think that making your own cards is like a great way to learn tarot, because it forces you to kind of make those associations on yourself, and it also forces you to basically like you're basically meditating on each card, because if you're doing art, it tends to be a very meditative and kind of trance state. So if you're someone who's artistically inclined, definitely you should try that. Even if you don't end up like putting them anywhere or really using them, it's a really good exercise to help you learn and memorize the cards. As far as like which one you should do between looking them up or letting the images go to you, if you're going to be using like the classic suits, for example, like cups, swords, pentacles, and all that, I think you are kind of much better to just let the associations come to you, just because they're suits that we've already heard about so often, and you kind of tend to already have associations with them. If you're going to be making up your own suits, it really depends on what it is. I was talking to someone who was using different types of plant categories to make up the suits. So basically, one was I can't really remember, but so I'm just gonna make something up right now. But let's say one was like trees, another one was flowers, another one was shrubs, and something like that. So in that case, because they didn't necessarily have like all of the knowledge that they would have, and it's a lot more based on like the properties of those things. So they were doing definitely more of a combination of what they associate with it, but also looking up the properties of those types of plants and seeing like what were the reoccurring themes within those types of plants. So I think it depends kind of, how much you're making up versus, how much you're doing on your own. But you can definitely do a combination of the two. Like ultimately, I kind of see tarot as, and this is, this really depends on the person. So this is like just how I interpret tarot, because for some people, the cards are sacred, and like the symbology in the cards is sacred, and like you can't fuck with that kind of thing. Oh, am I allowed to say fuck? I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure it's fine. But so like the cards would be, the meanings of the cards are really important. For me, I see tarot as more of like an alphabet, where I am interpreting, like I am kind of the interpreter between, the esoteric or spiritual, or, depending on what I'm doing, and the person that I'm reading for. So the cards in that case really are only serving me. So it's an alphabet that I'm supposed to understand so that I can make sense of it for someone else. So in that case, it's more important the personal correspondences that you have, instead of like using the symbology that other people are using. So it kind of depends on your viewpoint a little bit, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question kind of, or? Okay, good. That's great though. I think that's a really good way to and like basically, if in a way, if you think about it, like you are creating your own alphabet, so it's going to be like 100% customized to your associations, and like I think that's a great way to have like more accuracy, because you're not starting from someone else's alphabet, you're using your own. So yeah, I think that's a good way to go. Okay, awesome. Okay, so pretty much like anyone who I have read for knows that I always start everything with the 3-card spread. and I customize the spread always for every question, just because personally I find that easier for me, and I can kind of go from there and pull clarifying cards. Um, that's just my personal preference. If you like tend to make your own spreads in the first place, then it's not that much of an issue. But I have a really hard time following like rigid spreads, especially like the Celtic cross. I have a really difficult time making that one work for me. So I'm going to kind of go over like how you can use a 3-card spread to suit any question, and then also pull clarification cards on it. So I'm going to start with, again, like the three same cards that we had. So usually what I'll do for a 3-card spread is I'll have one card to kind of represent the situation as it is. So let's say the left card, the 9 of Cups, that would be representational of the current situation. And the purpose of that is to kind of show the situation as it is now, but in a clear way that isn't biased by the other person. So they already have an idea in their mind of what the situation is. So this is supposed to show it as it is versus what their perception of the situation is. Because I get asked a lot, like, I already know the situation, why bother have a situation card? Well, that's why. It's to show you an unbiased view of what the situation is. So that's usually the first card in every spread. And then the next 2 cards are going to be like 2 alternatives. I usually have one that I call like the downer card, and then the upper card. So the downer card is like the depressing card. So the downer card is like, what's the problem with the situation? Or what's the negative side of the question? So for example, if they're asking like, what should I do about this issue that I'm having with someone? You would have the situation, which would be showing their current relationship. The downer card would be showing like, these are the problems that you're having. Like, this is what's going wrong, basically. And you can apply that to almost any question. Almost any question is going to have like your basic situation, and then like the negative side of that situation based on what is going on right now. And the right card would be the upper card. That's like the alignment card. So that card is the one that you want to use to basically, the kind of question that I always ask for that card is, how do I align my actions with the goal that I want to achieve? So you can use that for like literally any spread. You can use that for a career spread, a relationship spread. You can even use that for past life spreads. Even my past life spreads, I always do like a 3-card spread to start with, and then you can pull clarifying cards on that. So yeah, so then once you have your 3 cards, you go to the clarification questions. So clarification questions, oh yeah, so the 3rd card would be the alignment card. So basically the 3rd card is, how do I align my actions with my goals? So basically, what can I do so that what I want, like I'm actually doing something that will achieve what I want. So for example, in a career spread, it could be like, what can I do to get the job that I want? Like, what are the actual things that I can do? In a general spread for, let's say, like the week, it could be, sometimes people don't necessarily have a specific goal. So in that case, it could be something like, how do I align my actions with my purpose, or, you know, something like that. So that way the 3rd card is always kind of the positive card in a sense, because it gives them something, it gives you something to do and something that you can actually act on that would help push you further towards that goal. So even if the goal is, let's say, like improbable or unrealistic, it's giving you a way that you can actually you know, put things kind of in your favor a little bit more if they're not already there. Did that make sense? Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay, so then clarification cards. So I think the main mistake that I see with clarification cards is people will say like, okay, so let's say the goals thread, like the alignment card, you know, I want more information on that because it's saying that I should let's say, you know, let's say it's a career card, and it's telling me I should focus more on, let's say, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank right now. But okay, so let's just pretend that I just said something really smart and that we have our third card, which is alignment, which is whatever your goal is. But let's say you still have questions about what the goal is and what you should be doing, and you're like not really clear on what it is. So usually when people will pull clarification cards, they'll only pull one card. They'll ask kind of like, what does this mean? Or can I get more clarification on this, for example? I find the best way to get clarification on a card is to pull two cards. I usually put one on the left and one on the right, and it will be, for example, like, what are you doing right now wrong, or that's not enough, or what you are like, where the area kind of where you're lacking. And the card on the right would be what you need to change to be able to reach the goal in the clarification card. And once you put those two qualities out, that usually clears up whatever it is that was in the card that you were lacking. So those would be the two clarification cards. So basically the one on the left would be like kind of the either the obstacle, the thing that's preventing you from being able to do the thing that would align you with your goal. And the card on the right would be like a more tangible, specific thing that you could do to improve that situation. So once you have the two clarification cards laid out, it usually, and you relay them to the other person, almost every time they'll be like, okay, yeah, I know exactly what that's about and I know what it means. And if you try it with yourself, you'll find also that that's usually the case. And you can apply the clarification cards to any card in the spread. Sometimes people even want clarification about the situation card because they're surprised at, let's say, the situation is not at all what they thought it was and they want more information on the situation. So by showing kind of the good and bad of the situation, that kind of helps point their mind to more specific things that they can focus on. I mean, that's kind of like the basics of how I would do spreads on the fly. And obviously clarification cards you can pull, you can continue to move the cards downwards. So you could get clarification on clarification cards as well, and those will all, you know, I always just do the two cards and kind of go that way and build the spread in that kind of sense. So yeah, that's kind of how I would do spreads on the fly. And that's kind of all I've got. So I did not think I would be like doing that so fast, but if you guys have questions, I'm happy to go through that. But otherwise, that's pretty much what I had set up.